Max-Ernest because he kept as far away from the water as possible. As Cass had discovered at an especially inconvenient moment during their adventures at the Midnight Sun Spa, Max-Ernest didn't know how to swim. But they were irritable for another reason. They'd been walking around the tide pools for over half an hour, and they still hadn't found a way to get away from the group. Cass had intended to say she had to pee. After she left, Max-Ernest would say the same. But Mr. Needleman insisted that the teacher's aide escort anyone who wanted to go to the bathroom, so that plan was out. Cass considered saying she was seasick and asking if she could walk back to the bus, but Max-Ernest, who was expert in all kinds of illness, pointed out that seasickness was something you got on a boat. It is a kind of motion sickness, and not something you got on the beach. Beginning to grow frantic, Cass interrupted Mr. Needleman in the middle of an explanation of red tides and asked if their class was going to be allowed any free time to explore.
You're always telling us to think for ourselves. How are we going to do that if we're following you the whole time?
Not many grown-ups would take that argument seriously. Mr. Needleman, however, seemed to have a sudden change of heart toward Cass.
You know, you're absolutely right,
he said, just like that. Cass was so surprised she almost continued arguing. Mr. Needleman told the class they could have a few minutes of freedom so long as everyone stayed within sight and no one poked the sea life. Cass looked at her watch. It was 10 minutes until noon. 10 minutes until they were supposed to meet Pietro Bergamo, the long-lost magician. 10 minutes until their lives as members of the Terces Society would officially begin. They could just see a wharf, with 3 docks on the opposite side of the bay, separated from the tide pools by several large rock outcroppings.
Walk slow and pretend you're just looking around,
Cass whispered to Max-Ernest. As they approached the rocks, the tide pulled out, leaving a narrow strip of beach between the rocks and the churning water.
Come on,
Max-Ernest wavered.
But
Would you rather swim?
By the time the tide returned, they were standing on a small patch of sand surrounded on all sides by jagged rocks, safe and dry for the moment. There was only one problem. Yo-Yoji had followed them.
Yo, dudes, where are you going?
He asked, wading through the surf. Max-Ernest looked at Cass. Now what? Cass glanced at her watch. They had 6 minutes.
Hey, Yoyoji, I know you don't really know us very well, but can you do us a huge favor?
Yo-Yoji agreed to act as lookout, on one condition, that they tell him where they were going.
Okay, but can we tell you afterward?
Without waiting for an answer, Cass nudged Max-Ernest forward. Yo-Yoji watched, at once irritated and intrigued.
Don't forget the 3-point rule. What's that?
Always make sure that 2 hands and 1 foot, or 2 feet and 1 hand are touching the rock beneath you,
said Cass, flashing a smile at Yo-Yoji. She thought she was the only person who knew that. And then she started up the rocks. Max-Ernest waited only until the tide came in and splashed his ankles. As they ran along the beach on the other side of the rocks, they found their way blocked by a crumbling shack, an old tackle shop decorated with a life preserver that looked like a shark had taken a bite out of it. A hand-painted sign advertised live bait. Cass and Max-Ernest both wrinkled their noses. The scent of rotten fish filled the air. They walked around the shack as quietly as possible, but when they got to the other side, it was boarded up. Nobody in sight. Until they heard a familiar New Zealand accent.
Cassandra? Max-Ernest? I know you Kiwi heads are out here.
The 2 Kiwi heads just had time to slip under a mound of fish nets before Mr. Needleman's ankles came into view. Flies buzzed around their noses and unidentified crawling things started investigating their legs. It was excruciating.
Come out now, and nobody will know. Otherwise, I'm warning you, I'll have you suspended.
How had Mr. Needleman known where to look for them? Cass wondered. If it was Yo-Yoji, she was going to make him pay. Mr. Needleman picked up a fishing spear that had been leaning against the shack and held it aloft. With his bushy red beard, he looked almost like a Viking, or some